Hi guys, Olive here. Here today to talk to you about what I read in December 2020. It was a little bit of a strange reading month for me. I did finish a number of different books, but the way I felt about them was all over the place. There were two that I didn't really care for, and then there were a number of middling books that I just didn't really feel a whole lot about, and then there were some that I really liked and a couple that I loved. So I did somewhat fulfill my mission of finding some books to put on my year-end fiction favorites list. I figured I would start off this video by talking about the two books that I wasn't the biggest fan of, and then move into talking about the more middling books, the ones I don't have a ton of feelings about, get those all out of the way, and then move into talking about the books that I really liked or even loved. So, starting off, one of the two books that I really didn't like all that much was surprisingly Singular Sensation by Michael Rydell. I really thought I was going to love this. I'm a huge fan of Broadway. I was very briefly a theater kid when I was in high school, and I had heard such amazing things about his previous book, Razzle Dazzle. This book essentially discusses a number of different Broadway shows that were really big in the 1990s, and then he concludes the whole book with a discussion about how Broadway brought New York City back together following the 9/11 attacks. Very big shows are discussed in this book, shows like Rent, Chicago, The Producers, The Lion King. He basically wants to talk about how all of these shows made their way to the stage and then how they fared with audiences. It's all interesting stuff, don't get me wrong, but it's told in such a stiff way, and that is so confusing to me because this author is a Broadway critic. You would think that he would attempt to insert his own commentary throughout, or that he would attempt to put his own voice in there whatsoever, and he just didn't. The whole thing felt so void of personality, which feels just wrong when you're reading a book about Broadway. It's researched well, but then he just regurgitates that information onto the page. It doesn't feel like a story, and nonfiction needs to feel like a story. It is not enough that the information is interesting. The author also has to make it feel like a story that you want to get sucked into. The organization is really weird in this book as well. The transitions were really sloppy. They were very abrupt. I'm not entirely sure that the conversation about Broadway after 9/11 belonged in this book. It didn't feel like it fit with the rest of the book. Unfortunately, by the end of the book, it just seemed like a big old mess. So I gave this one 2 stars. I was also surprisingly not super impressed by How to Catch a Queen, the first book in Alyssa Cole's new romance series. This book is about a young woman who has wanted to become a queen her entire life, and she's been in training to become a queen her entire life. But when she finally bags the new king of a small African country, her carefully cultivated skills are completely wasted when the new king, her husband, ignores her entirely, and she's kept out of all political matters. Things start to change when the king, her husband, starts coming to her looking for political advice because he is so new to this leadership thing. I'm not sure what was missing between these two chemistry-wise, but I just never really felt the spark between them. Also, I was very confused about why characters from her previous romance series, the one that kind of set up this new series, I was very confused why they kept popping up in this new series. I kept thinking to myself, if Alyssa Cole doesn't want to let go of those characters, which they're great characters, I can understand why isn't this just the next book in that previous series? Why is this a new series? There was one plot line that I was super invested in, though. There's this whole mystery of a missing god of this African country, and there's evidence of a cover-up. I don't know why that wasn't a more significant part of the plot because I was so interested in that. I really wish that had been a bigger part of the book. I am willing to move on to the next book in this series before I decide whether or not I'm going to commit to the whole thing, but this was a 2-star read. But moving on to books that I liked a little bit more, in December, I finally read George Orwell's classic novella, Animal Farm. Believe it or not, I had never actually read this allegorical story of farm animals overthrowing the farmer and starting to run the farm themselves. I liked it well enough. I thought it achieved its purpose of satirizing Stalinism, but Given my background in Russian history, there wasn't a whole lot that was new to me in here. I picked up this book in December because the PR firm handling publicity for a new indie video game based on Animal Farm reached out to me and asked if I would like an early review copy of the game to play and hopefully do a review of here on my channel. I love video games, so I very happily accepted, and I did a whole video about Orwell's Animal Farm, the game. If you'd like to see that video, if you'd like to hear me talk a little bit more about this book, how it relates to the video game, if you'd like to see some footage from the video game, I will link that video for you in the description box below and up in the cards. In the final month of 2020, I also decided to pick up a few cold, wintry, seasonal titles. The first of those was The Moth in the Mountain by Ed Caesar, which is the history of a British World War I veteran who got it into his head that he had to climb Mount Everest, which ended up having some tragic results. I also picked up Silence is So Deep by John Luther Adams, which is a memoir written by a composer who spent 40 years of his life living and working in Alaska. And Disappearing Earth by Julia Phillips, which is a novel that's basically told in short stories. It's about a remote Siberian community that is rocked by the disappearance of two young sisters. I don't have a ton to say about these three, unfortunately. I thought they all fit the wintry theme that I was going for, so that was nice. But Silence is So Deep and The Moth in the Mountain were both just decent. I thought they were largely unremarkable, largely unmemorable. Of the three of these, The Disappearing Earth is the one that I liked the most, but I was enjoying it much more in the early sections. It was really reminding me a lot of one of my all-time favorite novels, The Tsar of Love and Techno, which is also told using those kind of interconnected short stories. And it's also set in Russia, so there were a lot of similarities. But by the time I got to the end of The Disappearing Earth, it didn't feel like that comparison was all that apt anymore, unfortunately. It's hard for any book to compete with The Tsar of Love and Techno, not just because I love it so much, but also because every single short story within that collection needed to be there. And by the time you get to the end, everything comes together in such a perfect way. You see how everything is interconnected, like the most beautiful, challenging jigsaw puzzle. Whereas in The Disappearing Earth, it felt like a lot of the short stories in between the beginning and the frankly fairly predictable conclusion, they were there just to introduce you to some more characters in this community. It didn't really feel like I needed to hear their stories. It was interesting, but I don't see why it was necessary to introduce me to those people if they don't play any part in the conclusion. If you're a more character-focused reader, if that's the main thing you're looking for out of a work of fiction, then I think this may be more for you than it was for me. I felt the same way about The Essex Serpent, which was really beautiful, but just too character-focused for my liking. I think this book was not set up for success in my mind after the early sections because I started feeling like it was so similar to The Tsar of Love and Techno. And by the end of the book, it was something very, very different. It just kind of made me wish that I had reread The Tsar of Love and Techno. The classic book I picked up in December was also much different than I expected it would be. I finally read Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens, which is all about an orphaned boy who gets tossed around and then eventually gets caught up with a gang of criminals, and he can't escape from them because he knows too much. I had always presumed that this was a more kid-friendly book, I guess because Oliver Twist is himself a kid. I think he's between 10 and 12 years old throughout this book, but that is not at all the case. This book is extremely dark. I had no idea how dark it was going to be or that there was going to be a murder in this book. Like the other Dickens novels I've taken on up to this point, I liked aspects of this. I do think Dickens is really funny. I was laughing a lot when I was reading this. And also the mystery surrounding Oliver's parentage was a really unexpected thing in this book. I actually really, really liked that part of it. But my issues with Dickens pretty much still stand. I think he takes way too long to get to the point. I also surprisingly had some really big problems with the Wishbone adaptation of this book. It is the first episode of Wishbone that I can say definitively I did not like, and I think it got the book entirely wrong. If you'd like to hear my thoughts on that, I will link the latest episode of What's the Story Wishbone for you in the description box below and up in the cards. But moving into the books that I very much enjoyed, as expected, I really liked Actress by Anne Enright, which is all about the daughter of a famous Irish actress who finally decides that she's going to write about her mother and look into some of the long-kept secrets of her life. This was a really smart, really mature novel. The daughter of this Irish actress is a little bit older when she's telling us her family story. She's actually older than her mother was when she died. So she has a lot of perspective, she has a lot of wit, but also she has a lot of still unresolved grief. However, I don't think the story itself was as remarkable as the storytelling. I think the way it was done was a lot more impressive than what it actually was. I found myself a little bit, just the tiniest bit, underwhelmed at the end. And for that reason, I gave this 4 stars instead of 5. And then I also had 2 4-star nonfiction reads this month. The first of those 2 is The Book Collectors by Delphine Minuit, which is the entire history from beginning to end of a secret underground library in Syria and how it helped the residents of this town cope mentally with the devastations of the Syrian civil war. This is definitely not an uplifting read. It is absolutely devastating, especially because so much space within the book is dedicated to giving you context about what was going on with the Syrian civil war at the time, which I shamefully knew nothing about, so that was actually really helpful for me. So while I wouldn't say that this book is heartwarming, it definitely is a testament to the power of books and reading because of all the joy and the hope that this library and its books gave to the citizens of this town during this time. And my other 4-star nonfiction book that I read in December was Good Morning Monster by Katherine Gildener, which is a book written by a therapist. It tells the stories of 5 different patients of hers and the remarkable journeys and breakthroughs that they experienced. This one may not have been quite as amazing as Maybe You Should Talk to Someone by Lori Gottlieb, which quickly became one of my all-time favorite nonfiction books. I love that book. But this one came pretty close. It was really, really good. She starts off by talking about her very first patient, and throughout the book, she really isn't afraid to tell you about her own learning experiences and mistakes as a therapist as she's learning how to be good at her job. Unlike Group by Christy Tate, which I literally cannot recommend to anyone, there is a reason why licensed therapists have been highly critical of that book. This book, Good Morning Monster, shows healthy relationships between a therapist and her clients. Ones with boundaries, ones with respect, ones in which the therapist isn't playing God. Katherine Gildener was not perfect in her therapist-client relationships by any means. I don't mean to imply that. That is certainly not the way she represents herself within the book. She made plenty of mistakes and she is not afraid to acknowledge them in writing, which I very much appreciated. But you can tell that she genuinely cares for her clients. She's there for them in good times and bad. She patiently helps them through their problems. She lets them do it more or less on their own timeline while providing encouragement and support. She acted like a good therapist. You can tell she was just really good at her job. This book was really great. I loved it. I learned so much from it. It's a real shame that this one got overshadowed by Group because this one is much better. And then I did have 2 favorites of the month. The first was The Ensemble by Aja Gabel, which is all about a string quartet and the relationships between the 4 members throughout their career as an ensemble. This was one of the easiest 5-star ratings I've ever given in my entire history as a reader. The plot is very reminiscent of The Interstings by Meg Wolitzer, which is one of my favorite novels, but then I felt like it had the writing style of Rules of Civility by Amor Towles, which is my all-time favorite novel. So there just was not a chance I wasn't going to fall head over heels in love with this book. And then the final book I'm going to be discussing in this wrap-up is my other favorite of the month, and it was nearly a 5-star read. Moonflower Murders by Anthony Horowitz, the sequel to Magpie Murders, and another 2-for-1 special where you get 2 mysteries in one book. I really loved this book, as I suspect everyone who loved Magpie Murders will, But for me, it fell a little short of being as good as its predecessor, largely because it took such a long time to get into the second mystery. However, both Moonflower Murders and the Ensemble made it onto my year-end fiction favorites list. If you've not seen that yet, if you'd like to hear me talk a little bit more about both of those books and see where they ranked within my top 10, I will link that video for you in the description box below and up in the cards. So those were the books that I read in December 2020. I know this was a little bit more condensed than normal, but I didn't have very strong feelings about some of these books, and I must admit, I am really and truly ready to put 2020 behind me, as I know a lot of people are. But if you have any comments or questions about anything you've seen in this video or about anything in general, please do feel free to put them in the comment section below. Or if you would like to reach out to me somewhere other than YouTube, I am on a variety of different places on social media, and the links to all of my profiles will be in the description box below. Thank you so much for watching. Happy New Year. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.